How many of you in the audience have read the comic book? How many of you have seen the television show? How many of you have heard of the television show?
I've never heard of it.
Well, you'll learn some things today. It's about zombies. Not that they use the word. I am Dr. Travis Langley, professor of psychology, the author of Batman and Psychology of Dark and Stormy Night. And for Sterling Publishing, editing a new series of books and writing, I'm trying to say, what do I say? Definitely not author, editor and lead writer for a series of books starting with The Walking Dead Psychology, Psych of the Living Dead. Woo! It'll be out in August, right after the Star Wars Psychology, Dark Side of the Mind. And up here I have a collection of people who know things. We have psychological professionals and other individuals who are scholarly and knowledgeable in their own ways. We start at the far end and work our way back here. We'll work our way from our other colleagues through the Psych Pros.
Yeah, I'm one of the non-scholarly members of the panel. I am the author of Breathers, Zombies Laments, as well as the heartwarming holiday classic, I Saw Zombies Eating Santa Claus. So that's the relevance of my being on the panel, other than knowing Travis, is my relationship with zombies. The thing is that if we're discussing the last season of The Walking Dead, I'm going to have to cover my ears because I watch on Netflix. I don't have to watch it real time, so I'm going to have to cover my ears and go la la la, because I don't want to know what happens.
Hi, I'm Janie Tracy. I'm a writer for a sci-fi and science website called outerplaces.com. And I review The Walking Dead, but mostly I'm just a fan. I don't really know things, so here are the Psych Pros.
Hi, I am Dr. Geneva Scarlett. I'm a clinical psychologist and a scientist. I work with active duty Marines with PTSD, many of whom love The Walking Dead.
Hi, I'm Dr. Billy San Juan, and I am a psychosocial rehabilitation specialist with Community Research Foundation.
This is a really short cohort. My name is Dr. Patrick O'Connor, and I'm a professor of psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, where I teach a course called Geek Culture and Therapy, where we learn how to use comic books, video games, sci-fi and fantasy in therapy.
My name is Laura Taylor. I'm a graduate student right now, about to graduate in May, getting my master's in counseling psychology. I just received my certificate in traumatology and treatment. I write for my own blog, Therapeutic Code, and Josue Cardona, who can't be here today. He and I both write for geektherapy.com, and I've done a few podcasts with him.
I'm Elizabeth Ann, and I will be a doctor in the summer when I finish my internship as a graduate of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. And I am doing my internship at one of California's illustrious prisons, where I specialize in sex offender treatment. And a lot of my clients are returning vets or abuse victims. We have a lot of trauma that we deal with, so it's an area that I know quite a bit on. For my self-care, though, I run NerdLush.com, which is a little everything kind of nerdy fun website that just keeps me sane. And I'm sort of the odd one out because I watched The Walking Dead when I found out that I was going to be on this panel. I finished season 2 last night, so I'm going to hear a lot of spoilers, and I'm okay with that.
They live happily ever after. Why zombies? Why in the world have they gotten to be so popular in the past decade?
I don't know why they're really popular, but I had an epiphany in relation to trauma about them yesterday.
We'll get to that. Okay.
I'll throw out my opinion. A lot of times I'll have I don't write primarily zombie stuff. I write other stuff that's dark comedy and social satire. Zombies were just a way to sort of use that social commentary. But a lot of other authors who just write strictly zombie stuff will always talk about some sort of fear of terrorism and global economy and how that's why zombies are more popular now. But if you go back, they weren't this popular in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. They kind of blew up in the 2000s, and to me, they blew up in the 2000s for two reasons. One, they were taken out of their proverbial box, and they stopped being primarily just shuffling mindless zombies. They were running faster, they were making us laugh, they were in Fido, they were being used as sort of household, you know, they were like butlers and servants, and so it was a little bit more comedic. But then, of course, you had the internet come along, and all of a sudden you had YouTube, and you had zombies going to marriage counseling, and you had zombies trying to apply for a job or going to the DMV and waiting in line to get a driver's license. So it just exploded and became much more accessible to a lot more of an audience. Young adults, they started to have it written for them. You got Pride and Prejudice and zombies, and so even though, you know, fans of Jane Austen may or may not have enjoyed the book, it opened it up to a literary audience. So you just expanded your audience in the 2000s. So I think that's why it's exploded.
I think also after 9/11, there was this huge growth in terrorism, and I think there's something about having a common enemy that people can sort of unite against, but that's not representative of any specific nationality. That could be at least a part of the reason why people are so drawn to this apocalyptic theme.
And I feel there's a couple other aspects as well. Whenever you look at the zombie media, if you look at the movies, the books, the comics, the TV shows, the games, most of the time the zombies are there, but the focus is on the people and how they react. It's like a mirror for something where we know zombies aren't real, so we can explore the issues of people are going to panic, people are going to start blaming other people, other cultures, similar to what you were saying. It's a way for us to explore those issues without having it be way too personal and real. And there's also something about zombies that appeals to everyone. You know, I have friends who love the gore and the bleh. The bleh.
How do you spell that?
Bleh. That is the technical psychological term.
It's in the DSM 5.1.
It is. But there's also, you know, we have the people who enjoy the violence and the gore of it. And then you have the people who enjoy the reactions of the people in those situations. And then you have the spectrum of people in between. Kind of like the violence, kind of like the deeper stuff. So there's so much that appeals about it. Because I'm on that. I kind of like the action-y scenes in the comics and in the TV show of The Walking Dead. But I also like the downtime, where with a lot of the story happening when there aren't any zombies drawn or on screen. But there's still that connection that people have because there's that common experience that they're having and they're surviving together. And, you know, who in this room wouldn't like to think that in a massive emergency where all of our lives are on the line, we would be able to band together and survive, right?
I asked Robert Kirkman about this right before the TV series started. For those who don't know, Robert Kirkman created The Walking Dead. And Frank Darabont, who developed the show, the original showrunner, he was there at the time. And I asked him, Kirkman, about this. And he said that, well, after a previous U.S. president made the country such a horrible place to live, you need something even worse in your horror, to terrify and unnerve people. And what's worse than zombies? Trying to survive in this world. Max Brooks did a panel with George Romero and one of our books writers, Dr. Stephen Schlossman. You guys get me instead of Max and George. He got. But Max, he said something very similar to what Kirkman said, though not quite as tongue-in-cheek. He said that when you have a horror that's too much grounded in reality, it can be unnerving. You won't be able to sleep. When it's got that that extra step where you know this can't happen. You can watch the horrible thing going on. You can watch, people killing their neighbors, and as he put it, FEMA's failing, and the president's flying by, going, "Oh, that's peculiar." And but because it's zombies, he said, "Well, then you can go to sleep." It's not a film about nuclear war or something more realistic. So it's that filter of fiction phrase often used that steps a hair outside reality. When I teach forensic psychology, I can talk about some of the worst subjects in the world, and it can be very difficult for some of the students. And sometimes the topic can be so repulsive that they miss the point of what we're talking about, the psychological aspect of it. But then we go through this fiction, we're talking about how someone's facing horrors, and that fiction lets them look at it. Okay, that's why zombies. Why The Walking Dead in particular? Why is that what has really grabbed people?
I think the show is just, aside from zombies, it's just so real. You see these interactions with these people, and they look just like what a lot of people experience after a traumatic experience. I've had a Marine tell me that's what I go through. I have those same kind of nightmares. For those of you that remember the episode where Rick was having hallucinations and he was imagining talking to his wife, he was seeing her. I actually had a Marine tell me that he went through that same experience and that he was afraid of telling anybody because he thought that people were going to call him crazy. But seeing that on the screen somehow made it okay and made him understand that he wasn't the only one experiencing that, because clearly somebody wrote it and people are watching it and people are reacting to it. And I think there's something kind of healing about seeing the trauma that other people are going through and how they are bonding together and how they are experiencing this together.
They're very human characters, and not only do they bond together, but it also breaks them apart, which is very human in that we get a lot of strength from our experiences, but they also break us down. And especially with trauma, we tend to pull apart and isolate and avoid. And some of the characters do that, and some of the characters do that to the group. And others are the opposite, and they just pull it all together, and that reminds us all that we have the strength. So a lot of my guys see it, and they see it as, well, if they can survive the zombies, I can get through this thing that's thousands of miles away and over. So it's a strength growing piece for them.
Yeah, I think, like you were saying, it's the good and the bad. So you'll see in the show the worst of people. You'll see cannibals, you'll see people fighting, you'll see really horrible things, but then you'll also see the good in the people. You'll see Bob walking around trying to find the good in every little bad thing. You'll see Glenn and Maggie coming together and finding love. You'll see relationships growing, and they form a little family together. And it may be a messed up family, but it's a family.
Yeah, I think kind of touching on the points again of like the characters and the realism of it is that I remember an interview with Kirkman a while back where he said how much he just loves writing drama and just having, that if he could, he would just write like soap operas all day. But that he loves the idea of like throwing, zombies in there because it's like, I guess those are interesting to people kind of thing, a little tongue in cheek. But still, he really loves focusing on the characters and their interactions, and I think his quality of writing with focusing on the character development is wonderful. But kind of along with that, why that works in a zombie setting, that when we consider like monster movies and horror films and shows and things like that, a lot of them kind of focus on the monster as being kind of the central character, or the one that's the unique one to focus on. But with zombies, it's this kind of mindless horde. It's really about like the horror itself is the world, right? It's something that completely changes society, and that becomes kind of this almost enemy, this monster that you can't just say that's the name of it. That's the one person we have to stay away from with the chainsaw or the mask or what have you. It's more that then the focus goes kind of away from them naturally to the few people that we want to win, that we want them to survive and come out on top. And so when you kind of turn the focus on those few central human characters, having that depth in the book and in the TV shows really just pulls us in. We're always going to be kind of rooting for them.
And then the villains become other people rather than the actual zombies. The more compelling villains are the people and the darkness within themselves, because the compelling part of the zombie apocalypse is that it kind of breaks down civilization. Like we've been saying, the rules are kind of out the window. There's no society, that's no superego telling you not to do certain things. So you get to see human nature in its most distilled form, both the good and the bad.
And from a writing standpoint, a story is only as good as its characters. The story is good, it's great, but you have to have characters you can relate to. And The Walking Dead does a great job with that. The reason I like Stephen King is he does a great job of writing good characters. Lost had great characters, whether or not you hated the last season. Lost still had great characters that you cared about. The X-Files, when Mulder and Scully went away, the X-Files wasn't nearly as interesting because you cared about the characters. And you care about characters, you also start to hate characters. The Smoky Man and the X-Files. Stephen King makes great villains. And the Governor in The Walking Dead, each time he was on, it was just like, kill him! Come on! Just kill him! You gotta kill him. So you knew you were passionate at that point because you wanted him to die. Just get him out of there. He's going to ruin everything. And so I think that's part of it too. When you can relate to the characters, that's why the story matters.
Just a question. I'm supposed to feel that way about Carl too, right?
You'll get there. You'll get more there.
I really don't like him. Sorry.
She's been the first 2 years. Think back where you were with Carl 3 years ago. Where's Carl?
He'll grow on you.
How realistically does The Walking Dead comic book and or TV show depict the trauma and people's reactions to the trauma, whether the psych pros or the human beings at the other end of the table?
Can I tell you my epiphany now?
Have your epiphany.
Okay.
Share.
So I was thinking about this last night, because I was trying to figure out what I was going to say, because I'm not like them. I don't know everything. And it came to me that they have all this great downtime, and then suddenly the walkers show up. Just one, a horde, whatever. And that's a lot like how trauma is for a trauma victim. They can be doing really well, and then suddenly, bam, something will trigger it. And they may not even know what the trigger is, but something will just set it off, and they'll have the panic, they'll have the isolation, they'll have the avoidance, whatever their reaction is. And I think that they do such a good job of just showing, like, the whole group, to me, is like one trauma victim. And every time a walker shows up, they just, either they panic and they freak out, or they go badass and just start shooting everybody. It's really, that's what my trauma guys react like. So for me, they're just like, each walker is a trigger. So that was my epiphany. I don't know if I explained it well, but-
One thing I wanted to mention was focusing on Carl, and I'm going to kind of hopefully redeem him a little bit, but what I appreciate about Carl as a character is that his story in a fictional world reminds me a lot of some kids I worked with involved in foster care. Kids who were often neglected and abused themselves and left to fend for themselves at a very young age. And what I see in Carl's story of sometimes being left to care for his little sister or to learn how to shoot at a young age, in the book of course much younger, learning how to find food and how to get along with strangers, and all of this stuff is kind of cast upon him when Rick can't be as present as he would like to be. And the kids that I worked with in therapy at the time were going through a lot of those similar issues where mom and dad are busy using drugs, mom and dad are busy working the streets, mom and dad are absent entirely, they're neglectful, they're abusive, and so the parents, they're in jail, and so the kids themselves, one term for it is parentification, where a child, if an older child has a younger sibling and the parents aren't around to care for them, that older child will essentially become the parent in the family. And so now they have to be the mature one. They have to essentially lose their childhood at age 10 or 12 and become the one to learn how to cook, clean, and care for their 8-year-old younger sibling. And we're seeing this in Carl in the book and in the TV shows, and in kind of different degrees, of course, because of the differences in the story. And so the trouble that we see him going through in terms of losing that innocence and that fun nature kind of childhood and that whimsical wonder. That happens to kids every single day. That's the life they live. So I think that's absolutely a very realistic depiction of it.
What I really appreciate about both the comics and the TV show is that there's not a stereotypical way of representing the way that the characters are coping with the trauma. So the way that Rick was coping with his own symptoms was very different from the way that Michonne was, and very different from the way Carol was. And then without giving anything away from season 5, there's a character that seems to be exhibiting some symptoms. And what I liked about this particular character's symptoms is that when this particular individual was hearing certain sounds or smells or conversations, this person became really overwhelmed. And I see that a lot with people with PTSD, where they're so hypervigilant that every single thing becomes overstimulating and overwhelming. And it might be subtle, but that's already a pretty strong indicator of trauma.
Yeah, I've seen people complain about hating the character who's going through the most obvious PTSD reactions recently. And I was like, you either know who it is or you don't. And I'm like, you don't know Sasha. And it's like, we don't know what she would have been like in other circumstances. You know, we do not know this individual. We've seen what she is like in the situation, and it gets worse. There's a lot of PTSD among these characters. Some post-traumatic reactions without qualifying for it obvious. Carol's showing a lot more than a lot of people realize. Yeah. She's doing it in a different way. And so what kind of variety of PTSD? Because it's not exactly what people at large think it is. What do we see in PTSD? What is it?
Great question. So PTSD essentially requires that we have experienced a trauma or multiple traumas, which for all of our characters we have multiple traumas or some kind of a traumatic loss. And then we have a number of categories that people have to meet. So one is re-experiencing. So that would be having nightmares, flashbacks, or memories of what happened, which a lot of the characters seem to be going over. The other is hypervigilance, and I think that goes for pretty much every character that we see. So hypervigilance is being really jumpy, really reactive, but sometimes it can also be a little bit more subtle, like being irritable, kind of aggressive, or being overly stimulated as the particular character is in the current season. And then the other category is avoidance, so not wanting to be around people, not wanting to talk about what happened. So Michonne, for example, for the longest time had serious trust issues and did not want to be around other characters. And we're seeing some characters showing all of these very explicitly, and then other characters are a little bit more subtle. So like with Carol, for example, some of her distancing from other people and some of her mood changes, I think that's a little bit more subtle. It could be argued as to whether or not she has it. Regarding
like when she tells Daryl, I can't let myself think about that.
Right, just like subtle avoidances. And then, there's like timelines that has to be met. In order for somebody to be diagnosed with PTSD, they need to have experienced the symptoms for at least a month. So the character that we're talking about in season 5, I think has only had it for about a week, if we look at the timeline. So I don't think that character quite meets the criteria for PTSD yet. So if she was my patient in real life, I would probably diagnose her with what's called acute stress disorder, which means that they've been experiencing these symptoms for under a month. And then assuming that they continue having these symptoms for over a month, then they'd be diagnosed with PTSD.
So that time is a good point, because the combat veterans, which some of you brought up, a lot of them love the show. Because when you're undergoing ongoing trauma, well, there's no post to the post-traumatic yet. And how somebody acts in their traumatic situation, it can be different. And like you brought up hypervigilance. Hypervigilance, extreme alertness to danger, extreme readiness for danger, and the level of vigilance that's appropriate for the world they live in is different from what's appropriate for our world. So just their extreme alertness to danger by itself is not necessarily an unhealthy thing until it carries with them to another situation. And that's the thing a lot of combat veterans and other people who come through ongoing horrors and trauma in real life have trouble with.
Right. A lot of the guys that I work with that are combat veterans, they clearly exhibited the symptoms of PTSD while in combat. But because, like the hypervigilance, was appropriate for being bombed and attacked on a daily basis, according to the rest of the people around them, nobody realized it until they got home, and then they were still in that state, and somebody comes up behind them at the wrong time, and boom, they're in prison.
And I think one of the key words there is adaptive, where the behaviors that someone might experience, say in wartime, like you were mentioning, war doctor, is the adaptivity of the hypervigilance, as you mentioned. Let's say that you're in combat. It's hard to have those strong emotions because that detracts from the job that you have to do and the survival of yourself and your colleagues. I would have clients who would come to a community college where I did an internship, and they were there from combat, would serve in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and they would have trouble walking through the main campus at peak points of the day because there are so many people. And if you're in a combat zone and you don't know who is a danger and who is not, and you don't know anyone in that area, absolutely. But taking it from that situation, moving it to another situation where those behaviors are not adaptive, where they may actually interfere with your everyday functioning, is a pretty big piece. And I think another key about the trauma too is there's not a set criteria for, oh, this is a traumatic experience, but this doesn't count. Everyone has their own resiliency level, and everyone has their own capability of handling certain events to the point where it becomes a trauma. And not everyone is going to say, oh, I am being triggered, I had a traumatic experience. And I think that's a key point in The Walking Dead, and a lot of other media where people have where people exhibit PTSD, is in the media itself, the TV show, the comic, the book. It may be pretty obvious, but in real life, if we were to see that person, we might think, oh, they're having a bad day, or oh, they're a jerk. Why do they walk away every time? Or, oh, they never want to hang out with us in a large group. They must really hate us. So it's important. It's fascinating to me how when we're watching the show, it becomes kind of obvious because we see snapshots of important parts of these people's lives. And in real life, we may not get those important snapshots. We may just see small parts of the bigger picture.
What is post-traumatic growth? Anybody up here?
So post-traumatic growth is the individual's ability to adapt and develop and grow from their traumatic experience. So it might be somebody learning about what the trauma experience was like and then maybe becoming someone that helps other people. It's somebody building resilience, somebody becoming psychologically and possibly even physiologically healthier as a result of the trauma. It's something that can happen to some people, especially if they've had a good source of support after their traumatic experience.
Laura, you had something you want to say?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of examples of that. Almost all of these characters have positive aspects that have come from this and skills they've gained because of their experiences. You see Glenn, who's really good at going and running to get supplies, and he's become really smart, and how, especially without trying to spoil anything, this season, he knows what he's doing and he can lead.
They knew it was about The Walking Dead before they came here.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
The Walking Dead.
I thought this was a Star Wars fan.
I thought we were going to draw things.
Okay.
But yeah, so Glenn, he knows how to lead a team, and he's learned what works and what doesn't work, and you know, when people don't listen to him, he doesn't like it. So there are other things too. Say Michonne, she was, like we were saying, she's pretty distant from people, but then she grows to get this really interesting relationship with Carl, who everyone apparently hates.
Just me.
Just you.
I'm going to fuck it over.
But no, it's more of like a mentoring kind of relationship relationship. So there are positive aspects of these people coming out of this traumatic experience, and we see that all the time. I work with foster kids and at-risk youth, and we see, from this trauma, they can realize, maybe my family's messed up, but I can create a new family of my own from these people that have taken care of me for so many years in the foster system.
How many of you like Daryl? Daryl's pretty awesome, isn't he? Daryl is a great example of post-traumatic growth. So when he was a little child, his father abused him and his brother to a really, really bad extent, right? And in fact, when the series begins, Daryl is he doesn't like being around other people, he's angry, he's irritable, and over time, he actually learned to recover from his trauma in bonding with other people. He actually becomes really emotionally intelligent, he's open to his experiences, he's supportive of other people, and he's found new and different ways of coping with his trauma. Of course, in the current season, you can see how it still creeps up on him sometimes. But at the same time, he's grown so much from the way that he was when he was a child, and I think that's given him a lot of strength.
Well, one of the biggest things from a character creation standpoint in terms of fiction, I've never been a big fan of the angelic hero or the horrible villain, because there's always shades of gray. Every villain has his good points, and every hero has its flaws. A flawed hero is much more fun to root for than one that's absolutely perfect. And Daryl, one of the things about Daryl, Merle was his brother, right? Well, Merle was one of we talked about this, one of those who takes advantage. He was probably a jerk before. And I'm saying jerk because it says here that there might be people under the age of 18, so I can't use other language. Merle was a jerk to begin with, and this just made him more of a jerk. Whereas Daryl is kind of like an Oreo cookie jerk. He's hard on the outside, but on the inside he's soft and gooey. And that comes out as he goes along. He becomes much more personable, and he becomes a hero, where he could have very easily been a villain. And so that's one of the most fascinating character arcs for me to see. And character arcs, again, are what makes a story interesting. You want to see the characters you enjoy become better as they go along. They might have peaks and valleys, and that's okay. Everybody has peaks and valleys. Again, that makes it relatable. You can say, I would go through this. And so that's what I think is part of the appeal too, is being able to root for characters to transcend who they might otherwise be.
And I've always wondered about that in terms of the character creation and the writing aspect for these characters. Is it that there's the idea that this character will be affected and it's set beforehand? Or as the story goes along, is it the idea that, say, I haven't seen the 5th season yet, the person who is having this trauma that no one wants to mention develops this over the course of the story, and it wasn't pre-planned? Like, I don't know if you guys, I'm just curious about that.
Well, that would depend on the individual writer. In writing circles, you're either a plotter or a pantser. You either plot everything out and you know how everything's going to go, or you write by the seat of your pants. You discover the story as it goes along, and it depends on what Kirkman did. And obviously, it depends on how close the series is following the comics. If it's straying from that, you'd have to ask Robert Kirkman how he wrote everything out. But a lot of times the characters are what drive the story, and you let them tell the story, and if you get in the way of what they would actually do, that's when the story bogs down or does not seem genuine, doesn't seem real. If what the characters are doing seems like what they should be doing, the chances are the characters are driving the story, and the writer is letting them do what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, Kirkman has said he has his long-term plans. He knows where he thinks things are going, but the characters surprise him. He says, okay, I think such and such is going to happen about 2 years from now, but I could suddenly have a 6-month detour. So there's a mix. Not everybody's strictly one or the other. It sounds like he wants to be character-driven, but he has his long-term plot that he hopes he veers back into. So, something you touched on too. What does it take? What brings out the heroism in some and villainy in others? Why do some become better people while others become worse in these extreme circumstances.
How we cope with them, our resiliency and our coping skills. If we don't have coping skills and we react in what's easy, we go back to what's easy, and sometimes going the negative route is the easiest route. Becoming a villain is easier than being the hero and making tough decisions. It's easier to just go kill somebody than it is to go and try and save them.
I think a sense of purpose. Do you guys remember in season 4, Abraham Ford was getting ready to commit suicide, and then he saw Eugene, and he gained a sense of purpose. If I take this guy to DC, then maybe we can put an end to this. And suddenly, his whole life changed for a short amount of time. And we see that this change in Eugene too. He goes from being completely self-absorbed to changing. That's all I'm going to say. And I think that that same thing also happens in Rick, right? He's before he holds his daughter, he's experiencing so many symptoms, and he is just alienating from other people. He becomes like a Rick-tator, right? He's just my way or the highway. And yet when he is finally able to hold Judith for the first time, he regains the sense of purpose. I'm here for my children. I'm here to protect these people. And he softens. And I think that that makes a really big difference about whether or not somebody's going to become a hero or a villain.
Yeah, I think also hope has a lot to do with it as well. Kind of like paired with that feeling of purpose is that when somebody when you have a sense that others have higher expectations of you, especially if you care about that person and that relationship, we naturally feel driven to accomplish those higher expectations. And so when we're surrounded by loved ones and people we care for, and they say, you know, I know that you can fill this need. I know you'll help us with this someday. I know you can take this on and you can handle this. We feel that rubs off on us, and we feel like we can take that on. We can face whatever the trouble is. When the expectations aren't there, they're either absent or the expectations are lower than kind of where we're at. That can be a little harder to go kind of stretch yourself above and beyond and to become heroic. If somebody expects you to fail at everything you try, because that seems like what you've been doing so far. If people expect you to again fall flat on your face, to make mistakes and to screw up and all that, this is what the people you care about are telling you, then that could be that could influence, of course, your outlook. Likewise, if you feel like you're moving in a positive direction, you're moving toward good, but you're not feeling satisfied enough with the reward of the outcome, you start getting distraught over, I'm trying and it's just not working. If you don't have that kind of inner strength, you could abandon that entirely. Just when you think that you're helping your family, and your family all gets killed, in the just as hypothetical in the show or in the book, then do you lose that purpose? Do you lose that sense of hope? And you think, why even bother? Why should I even care about anything now? Everything's hopeless, and so I'm just going to do whatever until I get taken out too.
I know people who have only seen the TV show, and they've gotten accustomed to, okay, they find a farm, it's going to get overrun. They find a prison, it's going to get overrun. They find a town, it's going to get overrun. Those of us who know the comics won't tell you. And so the people who knew the TV show, very different expectations about what's going to be happening in this community. The individuals in that community, who Rick and Carol and others view as children, their reactions to these individuals who've been out there, how does that compare to the way people treat traumatized individuals in the real world? Does it? Do traumatized individuals in the real world encounter, warmth and understanding from every person they encounter?
No. No. It's a great question. So I have a lot of my Marines that I'm working with are telling me that when they go to a birthday party, let's say they're balloon animals, maybe they went to a child's birthday party, they're balloon animals, they feel uncomfortable being around balloons because if a balloon pops, they drop to the ground. And it's things that we might not even think about. For those of you that have not been in the service, might not always realize. If you have been in a service, or if you've had a family member who have, then you probably know this. Things like 4th of July fireworks can make such a big difference. And I think that very often people who have a trauma history, whether it's from combat, whether it's from rape, whether it's from something else, have such an increased reaction that other people might call them strange or weird or tell them, hey, just get over it. And it, of course, can come off as very, very critical. And it's not surprising that people with such severe trauma might not want to be around other people who haven't, for the fear that they won't understand, for the fear that they'll be in a situation that will put them outside of their comfort zone and potentially will seem dangerous.
Which is one of the reasons it's really important, if you do know somebody who has trauma, to make sure the people in their family get some education on it as well. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that while a lot of people, of course, we're all plenty well-intentioned to care for people who've experienced trauma, a lot of it does, I think a lot of that, that lack of understanding contributes to that, uncomfortable exchanges between people, maybe judgment and misunderstanding. I'm thinking about if we haven't experienced the trauma directly so intensely ourselves, and we're trying to understand what it was like to go through, we may think of a potentially difficult situation we face and think, oh well, it's maybe it's not so bad if you just do this, it'll be okay. Have you tried, thinking about this or trying this other thing? When I know you're struggling with Crohn's. When I get an upset stomach, I drink some tea. Have you tried that? It's like it's not. These are two very different things, right? This is you may have had something very small like what I'm going through, but I'm going through something that's very complex and something that really takes over a lot of what I deal with on a regular basis. And so again, I think that while plenty of people are very well intentioned, that when we haven't experienced that necessarily ourselves, that misunderstanding leads to a huge kind of communication gap, and those misunderstandings can potentially grow into judgment and kind of painful exchange.
Most of the time, it's a lot better to ask the person, what was that like for you, than to offer advice when you have no idea what that experience was like for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of my interests as well is in masculinity, and for men who have PTSD or who undergo reactions due to trauma, men are socialized that feelings of vulnerability, feelings of weakness are a big no-no. They're even taught that there are certain emotions that are okay. You can feel angry. You can feel, you can feel angry. You can feel happy, but not happy. I'm doing great with the terminology. But if you feel weak, if you feel sad, if you cry, those things are the social equivalent of non-masculinity. So imagine being, someone who has PTSD or who experiences a trigger, and you're around other guy friends, and everyone's holding these ideas and values, whether you know it or not, because they've been ingrained in us since childhood. And you start feeling those sad feelings, those scared feelings, those helpless feelings.
Walking Dead keeps bringing up the tagline, fight the dead, fear the living. Although this last half season they did have in there beyond fear, find hope. Because fight the dead, fear the living is pretty cynical. Is The Walking Dead pessimistic or optimistic story? Is it just a cynical look at human nature?
I feel like when my wife and I go to watch the show, she's always begging, like, we gotta watch, because we're always a couple shows behind, so like we gotta catch up and stuff, and she's like pushing to watch it, and afterwards I'm like, I feel so miserable. Well, like, I love the show, but like the whole hour, and then reading the book, like, why does this keep me up at night? Like, why do I do this when I'm just like depressed or anxious or angry, or like, that it touches, from a personal perspective at least, like it always touches on really uncomfortable emotions for me, and I think that speaks a little bit to kind of its cynicism of just like this isn't a really feel good kind of experience.
It's an apocalypse. I don't really grasp apocalypses as feel good experience. They sound like big downers to me. I don't know.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think we get an optimistic, hopeful episode. There was at least one I can think of this in season 5. Sorry, I haven't gotten that far yet.
I'll forget by the time I get there.
But we'll get like one of those, and we'll see some really good, hopeful moments, and then like 5 horrible, miserable things that you're at the end of the episode and you're like, why did I watch that? But then you'll get that hopeful one and you're like, oh, this is going to be great. And all over again, it's a continuous cycle.
I think we stay with the characters because we have hope. There are times the characters, when they don't feel hope, you still say, then why are you doing this? I'm trying. They're kind of like, they're hoping to find a reason to hope. We got a couple of minutes for questions or comments or insults or bribes. All right. Yes.
I like bribes.
Thanks for your time today. For the folks with a couple of extra letters before or after their names.
I've got Junior after my name.
You mentioned trying to find a resource by which you could understand what folks with PTSD are going through, like Al-Anon for alcoholic families, or families of alcoholics. Is there a similar organization or something that's starting to develop for folks who know or have loved ones who have been diagnosed with PTSD?
I need to defer to the clinicians.
It's a great question. Sadly, there are not enough of those right now. The VAs do offer some classes for family members of veterans, and if the person is in the service, active duty, then the military does offer some education classes for families. There aren't enough. I'm hoping for more. If anyone is in San Diego, I am more than willing to hold a group in San Diego providing education to family members. But there really aren't enough. That's a wonderful question. Thank you.
In regards to the people that I work with, they have a variety of different kinds of trauma, aiming from childhood abuse to gang membership to combat and anything in between. So Google is my best friend, and just Googling the type of trauma, or if it stems from a rape or being mugged or whatever, and trauma, and then from there, there's usually community type resources, and that includes educational for family, for friends, or even just picking up a what is trauma book, and if it's just something that you want to be more aware of, so that you're more open to the people in our world, and something basic like that would just open your eyes quite a lot.
Question? Yes.
Sometimes I wonder how many of the characters had psychotic tendencies before they are now brought up.
That is an excellent question.
As opposed to trauma. What role does society kind of play in keeping those impulses in check?
Well, of course, society is also a different issue from the trauma bringing out the potential, too. So you've got several different issues going on there. How many of these would not have gone so bad or become villains or psychotic, without these circumstances to bring them in?
Well, I know that when it comes to like psychotic breaks are common around like the late teenage to early 20s kind of years, and that's the one theory why that might be is because people kind of getting thrown into the real world and having to face their own responsibility of self-care or making decisions in college or having adult relationships or finding a job, and a lot of like childhood is done at that point, and so the stress of life of saying here you go now causes people who may have had those kind of markers growing up to really start to show some symptoms. So I think what's related to The Walking Dead, there's this is like that 1,000-fold in terms of life stressors being thrown into this kind of a civilization, this kind of chaotic civilization. Absolutely would bring up things that may have been there in the first place, but I would speculate that for some people may not have ever shown up in the real world because it just never got to that level of stress.
What else? Yes.
Speaking about villains, I was wondering, and this could be for anybody on the panel, what do you think makes a better villain? Is it better that they're just kind of like outright evil and I want to be able to just do the most evil thing possible? Or does it make it better that the villain is kind of like shades of gray, that if you see it from a different point of view, that maybe they're the hero in their story?
Try to stay within psychology on this
answer. In the grand sense of thing, everyone's the hero of their own story, so the villain does think that they're the hero, at least from the standpoint of, not from a psychological standpoint and medical standpoint, but from a storytelling standpoint. When you think about it, everybody is the hero of their own story. I'm a bigger fan of Shades of Grey. I mean, The villain who is an outright villain is really fun to root against, however. I mean, in pretty much every James Bond villain doesn't really have any shades of gray. The governor really, to me, doesn't have shades of gray. When you just hate this person so much that you want them to die, there's nothing particularly redeeming about them because they...
He's really nice to his daughter.
Yeah. I find it to be more realistic and from a storytelling standpoint, more compelling to have the shades of gray in the villains. That doesn't mean that there's not a place for just a straight diabolical evil genius. That's what all the superhero villains and everybody. But look at Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor doesn't have a whole, at least in the movies, doesn't have a whole lot of redeeming qualities. But he's kind of a fun villain in a way. He's almost a playful villain, and that makes him a different type of villain. So I think it's up to the person who's watching as to what type of villain they prefer.
Yeah, we're probably a year away, maybe even two. We're probably 1 year away from when a more complex villain comes up to bat.
But I think that's the beauty of The Walking Dead too, is you have both. It's hard to find redeeming human qualities in zombies. So you have the villain of the zombie, very few redeeming qualities, but you also have these characters like the governor. And I mean, I actually, we can agree to disagree on this. I mean, I feel the governor is doing what he feels is best for everyone else, which is a rigid society for survival. So, we see him from the perspective of Rick's group, and from that perspective, absolutely, he's a jerk, to put it lightly. But from his perspective, he's taking care of people, maybe not in the best way, but like you mentioned, he's the hero of his own story. So there's that, you get both in The Walking Dead.
Last question. Over here.
Me?
Yes.
Okay. This might be almost more like psychology of the audience. But aside from the rising trend of zombie shows, I feel like there's a rising trend of us having characters that we're falling in love with, and then they are just slaughtered. Along with Game of Thrones. So aside, does it seem to just be the thrill of that, or the anticipation, or why might it be that we're so obsessed and kind of, morbidly, masochistically into these shows?
I love that question.
A great but big question.
Yeah. I love that question. Thank you so much for asking that. I think that the characters are becoming more complex, and I think they're becoming more relatable. And I think there's something really uniting about them, right? Raise your hand if you ever had an experience where you felt like you were all alone and nobody got you. And now, either keep your hand raised or raise your hand again if you ever had a character that you really identified with and you're like, oh, that's kind of similar to what I go through. And that's when we kind of fall in love and we're like, oh, I get that. I've been through that, whether it's bullying, whether it's a loss, whether it's just feeling insecure. And when we connect with another character, we kind of fall in love. And then, of course, if we lose them, it's devastating. So I think as we're starting to have more psychological writing, we're starting to identify with characters more.
All right, thank you. Where can they find each of you online? Let's start. Oh, also, you can pre-order this through Amazon. All right, at this end, work our way toward me.
You can find me online at www.sgbrown.com. I'll also actually be signing books from 1 to 2 today after this panel at Mysterious Galaxy booth 908. So even if you don't want to buy a book, you can come by and say hi, and because it's boring sitting here for an hour not doing anything.
I review The Walking Dead at outerplaces.com, and you can find me on Twitter at JaneyTracy, JaneyTracey.
I'm on superhero-therapy.com or on Twitter at ShadowQuill, like the thing you write with.
I can't afford web hosting, so I have a professional Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Billicent, BILLICENT.
You can find me just by Googling Comicspedia, so the word comics, like plural comics, and PEDIA. Comicspedia is my Twitter, my website, my database, my everything.
You can get in contact with me and find my writing at therapeuticcode.com. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, and if you want to check out my writing at geektherapy.com, I'm there as well.
I You can find my personal, sometimes psychological stuff on my Twitter, Elizabeth_Ann with no E on the end, or NerdLush.com, on my website, which we have a lot of guest posters too, if anyone wants to write for us. And the Twitter for that is also NerdLush Diva.
I am at Superherologist on Twitter. Easy to find on Facebook, and you can find a whole lot of us through Facebook.com, The Psych Geeks. Thank you all so very much.